Alrighty, we're going. This is Joyce. She lives in a small island in Papua New Guinea. And a normal day for Joyce might involve going out to reef, fishing, or perhaps getting mollusks, which she might bring home to smoke or cook to sell at market, or maybe to feed her family. And like Joyce and her community, there are millions of people in developing coastal communities for whom coral reefs are really part of the fabric of everyday life. And so it's these people who are going to be most deeply affected by the threats to coral reefs from things like climate change. And so for us as scholars and for conservationists and managers, the real key question is how can we best conserve and sustain ecosystems so that they can continue to provide for communities like Joyce and her community who most directly depend on them. And one of the key ways that conservationists and economists have been thinking about this is through the idea of ecosystem services. Now, ecosystem services thinking started around the 1990s when people realised that in economic or policy decision-making, often the environment got left out. So the argument behind ecosystem services is if we can measure and value the importance of the environment to people, then we can make more arguments for better protecting it and sustaining it. And so scholars of ecosystem services started to develop frameworks to try and understand how it is people benefit from their environment. And I'm going to introduce a very simplistic version of one of these taken from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So the basic idea is that ecosystems provide different services to people, things like provisioning services, those material things like fish for food or for livelihood. They regulate our environment, providing, for instance, coastal protection. And they also provide people with those less tangible things, cultural benefits, cultural values. So, for instance, the ability to sustain important traditions, fulfill spiritual values, or perhaps aesthetic values. And all these different services that ecosystems provide support people's well-being. And if you start to think of ecosystem services in this way, which people have been doing, you start to say things like the global value of ecosystem services is between 16 to 54 trillion US dollars per year, and this is in 1997. So this is starting to make the argument that actually if we start valuing the environment, it's as, if not more important than some global domestic product. And so because of the strength of this argument, ecosystem services become really, really popular, particularly in research. So economists and conservationists have called ecosystem services the most important trend, a renaissance, a new paradigm. And this hasn't just been in research. It's flowed on to sort of a ballooning of different institutions and projects that base their research and work on ecosystem services. And this has led also to the application of the idea. So you may have heard of the UN REDD program, which aims to reduce emissions from deforestation. And a lot of the projects that the REDD program pursues are payments for ecosystem services schemes. So the idea here is that you can look at an area of forest and you can calculate the value of the carbon sequestered in that forest. And then you can pay local people that value in order to not deforest that particular section of forest. And these sort of applications of ecosystem services are also moving to the marine realm. So the Blue Carbon Initiative is aiming to do similar payments for ecosystem services projects around mangroves. And I've heard people talking about blue carbon sequestration things in terms of payments for ecosystem services for fish. I don't know how much carbon fish sequester, but you can also pay for other types of ecosystem services. So this all seems well and good. There's sort of a flurry of research and activity and funding going towards ecosystem services. But there's a small problem that is really a bit of a challenge and a barrier to the idea of ecosystem services helping people in communities like Joyce and her community. And that is a premise that underlies a lot of the work in ecosystem services, which goes a little bit like this. A lot of research assumes that if you have an ecosystem, there's a flow of services which create benefits, which therefore improves everyone's well-being. So protecting an ecosystem equals more benefits, equals greater well-being, everyone's happy. But social scientists in other disciplines have emphasised again and again that the aggregate availability of something doesn't necessarily flow directly to benefits. And so the sort of archetypal example of this is the work of Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, who was studying famines in Bengal. And he found that in Bengal, lots of people were in fact starving, but it wasn't because there was not enough food. Instead, it was actually because people didn't have the ability to access their food. So in that case, it wasn't the aggregate availability, but rather issues around people's ability to get the food itself. And social scientists have looked at ecosystem services and emphasised that a lot of the research is based on this idea that more is better and that benefits will automatically trickle down and help everyone. But the key problem with this is that it obscures social differences. And political ecologists have long emphasised that things like gender, ethnicity, and class really shape who gets what and who uses different natural resources. So to give a much more concrete example of that, in Madagascar, this woman who gleans octopus for a living is going to use and value reefs and her environment quite differently from these visiting international tourists and from this smallholder farmer who perhaps buys reef fish every now and again to feed his family, or this NGO worker who's trying to set up aquaculture ventures. And in obscuring social differences among the way people value their environments, the more is better myth also hides inequities. We know that inequities, we really need to address inequities in conservation and management because issues of fairness matter really deeply to people. So Mike Fabini, in some of his work in the Philippines, found that people cared more about whether different groups were using destructive methods that were unfair than they cared about this more than whether their fishery was going to be actually sustainable in the future. So not only is ignoring or accidentally hiding issues of inequity unethical, it can also negatively impact outcomes. So when people feel that their views haven't been taken into account or that an intervention is unfair, they're less likely to play by the rules. So ecosystem services, given the sort of growth in research and interest, it has a lot of potential, but what it really needs is to better account for social differences and equity. So this is kind of the broad aim of my thesis, understand how ecosystem services might best do this. So to start answering these questions, I turned to broader literature and identified 3 key themes, some of which draw on disciplines outside ecosystem services to better enhance ecosystem services. So I'm going to go through these. One is a more in-depth treatment of values. The second is looking more at access. And the third is looking at local perceptions of fairness and what is fair. And when it comes to values, I mean, valuation and measuring ecosystem service has really been the bread and butter of ecosystem services. So there's not really a need to borrow from other disciplines to enhance how ecosystem services values things, but there is a need with these valuations to start disaggregating by social diversity. So I mean, breaking things down by gender and wealth, and things like that. A lot of studies have also failed to investigate much beyond those provisioning services. So those are the material things that are perhaps easier to measure monetarily. And linked to this is there's not been much work trying to examine non-monetary values of ecosystem services. And finally, as I think occurs in quite a few other disciplines, there seems to have been a real split between studies of terrestrial ecosystem services and marine ecosystem services, which of course is a problem because coastal communities obviously depend on and use both. So to address this gap, I'm asking which ecosystem services matter to who and why in coastal communities, and I'm going to talk about that in chapter 2. So moving from what matters to who's actually able to access and benefit from ecosystem services. So we've established that benefits don't just flow uniformly, and a way to start then thinking more deeply about what are the sorts of things that help or hinder people benefiting from things. A really useful literature here begins with the work of Rubo and Peluso, who are political ecologists. And they define access as the ability to benefit from things, and they argue that there are 9 key ways that that people do this, and it falls across 4 themes. So one of these is rights of access, or perhaps land tenure, land ownership. This is kind of being the realm of property theorists. But there's also things like local environmental knowledge, more economic dimensions like capital, access to markets, technology and labour, and the more social elements like authority, social identity, and social relations. So when it comes to coral reefs, we're lucky enough to have some great work that's shown that social and institutional mechanisms are really important for mediating the benefits that ecosystem services provide to people. But there hasn't been much work that actually drills down to look at how key access mechanisms work to enable or block people from benefiting and how this affects different groups differently. There's also been a little attention to how key institutions, for example, customary institutions, change over time and how much this might affect access to goods. So I'm asking, how do access mechanisms, particularly with a focus on the social and institutional mechanisms, shape people's ability to benefit from ecosystem services in Chapter 3? And finally, moving from what matters to who gets what, to actually what people perceive of as fair, which is actually, and I'll get to this later, a bit different to who gets what. And a key literature to draw on to address this gap is environmental justice. And theorists working in environmental justice posit that there are different dimensions of justice that we should be analysing when it comes to natural resources for environmental governance. One of these is distribution of costs and benefits. So when you're looking at this dimension, you might ask things like who gets what, who benefits, who bears the costs. And the second dimension I'm going to talk about today is procedure. And so that's really about decision making. Who decides, who makes management decisions, how are these decisions made? But the really key progress in environmental justice has been to emphasise that the sort of criteria that define whether these different dimensions of justice are fair are not necessarily the same in different places. Rather, they're context dependent, and this is sort of being called empirical equity, but I'm not going to go into the details of that. But basically, the idea is that in one place, it might be fair that people benefit equally or share the costs of something equally. In other places, it might be more important to people, and people would think it would be more fair for people who have a greater need to benefit more, or perhaps to bear fewer costs. In other places, it might be based on merit. So, for example, in South Korea, Andrew Song found that fishermen were really concerned about equity in their management, and for them, it would be fairer if those who worked harder and lived closer to the fishery benefited more. And so there has been a little bit of work drawing on environmental justice literature and applying it to ecosystem services, but this has mostly been with a focus on payments for ecosystem services. And kind of as an extension of that, there's been a real emphasis on the aspect of distribution. And often studies have used predefined criteria of what's fair, and often this has been equality, so they might analyse distribution of things and class it as unfair if things aren't equally distributed, rather than drilling down to local perceptions of what's fair in a given context. So I'm asking, what is fair distribution of benefits and cost and fair procedure for managing coastal ecosystem services in Chapter 4? And so broadly, my thesis looks like this. I'm starting by asking what ecosystem services matter to who, why, how people benefit from them, and then what people think about this, what people really consider to be fair. So those are my 3 data chapters that I'll start to talk about in a second. We've just sort of gone over quite quickly the Chapter 1, which is trying to draw on other literatures to expand ecosystem services. And I'll finish up with the discussion. So in order to answer these questions, I've taken a case study approach, partially because this is a really good way of testing and challenging dominant ideas and helping to revise hypotheses on general points. So the idea here is if you conduct a really in-depth case study and find lots of exceptions to the sorts of ways that ecosystem service frameworks assume ecosystem services and humans relate, then you can say that there's a need to tweak the theory and the framework, and it kind of feeds back in that way. And of course, particularly the questions around justice are really context dependent. In fact, that's one of the key tenets of environmental justice theory. So it really requires fine scale detail. And I carry out my case studies in Papua New Guinea in 2 sites. One is Kaka Island, which is on my little icon, is a volcanic island which is really fertile in Medang province. And the other is Arcus Island, which is a low-lying atoll, which is quite highly vulnerable to climate change, and that's where Joyce and her community are from. And these are interesting to contrast for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they're similar in many ways. They're similar sized, communities. They both use and depend on coral reefs. And finally, they both traditionally have customary systems of managing their coral reefs. So they also differ in ways that make them interesting to contrast. Firstly, they have very different levels of dependence on fisheries, which is much lower in Kaka, whereas there's a high dependence on fisheries in Ahus Island. Customary management of reefs is much stronger in Kaka and weaker in Ahus. And in terms of the health of the ecosystem, and this is a pretty big generalisation, but Kaka is doing a bit better. It's considered more healthy, whereas Ahus's reefs aren't doing so well. Okay. So what matters to who and why? In my first data chapter, I was aiming in both Kaka and Ahus to identify the key ecosystem services that matter to people, assess differences in their perceived importance, and also analyse why people ascribe this importance in the first place. And so to do this, I undertook socioeconomic surveys to elicit key socioeconomic variables like gender, age, wealth, source of livelihood, years of school and migrant status, whether people had been born in the community or had lived there. And I then carried out a rating and ranking exercise of ecosystem services, which I'll explain in a minute. The key thing to note here is that I carried out these exercises with men and women from the same household, and that's going to be important when I talk about my results with gender. And I also conducted a short interview with people, asking them about their ratings and their rankings. And so the results I'm going to present now are just sort of triangulating between these different methods. So firstly, what ecosystem services matter to people broadly, we sort of narrowed it down to 11 ecosystem services, which fell along terrestrial, cultural, and marine. So the terrestrial ecosystem services were forest materials, crops, and fuel wood. The cultural ecosystem services included educational knowledge, tradition, and bequest values. And the marine ecosystem services were around sanitation, reef materials, habitat, fishery, and coastal protection. Now, one of the limitations of this approach, of course, is that because we wanted to do a rating and ranking exercise, we couldn't kind of free list and come up with, 30 or 40 ecosystem services that were important to people. They had to be manageable for people to rate and rank. And so that's why there are perhaps less than they would have been had we tried to do a comprehensive ecosystem services test. And so what we did once we'd identified these services was take photos that represented them alongside a short explanation of the ecosystem services and ask people to rank them in order of importance and then rate them in order of importance using counters. And what we found was, what we found, we analysed the data. So we ran general linear models on the rate count to see if there was any social differentiation, if people with different socioeconomic characteristics rate things differently. And I also conducted one sample t-test on the gender differences, and I did this by calculating a score of difference for each ecosystem service within a household by subtracting, say, the wife's score from the husband's score. What we found, broadly, people attributed most importance to those provisioning services that fulfilled their basic material needs, so things like crops, forest materials, and fisheries, or ecosystem services, which in this case is a supporting service, habitat, which they perceived to be really important for supporting fisheries as a provisioning service. We found that cultural ecosystem services tended to be rated a lot lower, except for education. And another reason for this in explanations was that people perceived that the more education and knowledge you had about a reef, the better the habitat and fishery. When it came to the cultural ecosystem services, in our short interviews, we found that people really perceived these as being dependent on provisioning services. So here's a small example. One man said to me, when habitat is good, there are plenty of fish, which we can use for celebration. So this starts to suggest that perhaps cultural ecosystem services don't really get properly represented in these sorts of ecosystem services valuations. Another really interesting finding was that ecosystem services that were perceived to be destructive were rated lower. And I found this very interesting because in both Ahus and Kaka, people don't use any other fuel except for fuel wood. There's very few gas stoves or anything like that. And Indeed, in Aarhus, there's no real other option for sanitation except for throwing waste into the ocean. And yet these were rated very low. This quote kind of captures why. Reef materials come last in ranking because it will ruin everything else. I don't think sanitation is good, it's bad for the reef. I'm not happy with cutting fuel or using reef materials. It will ruin the environment. So what about when we started digging deeper into whether there were social differences? Well, we found a few, and they're probably not that surprising. First was that those who had livelihoods most associated with agriculture tended to ascribe higher importance to crops. Those who were wealthier and had more years of schooling tended to prioritise fishery and habitat a bit more. For those who were poorer and younger, ascribed more importance to forest materials and fuel, and fairly unsurprisingly, those with more years of schooling placed more importance on knowledge and education. When it came to gender, there were some quite interesting differences, and they were quite subtle, but women tended to rate forest materials, fuel wood, sanitation, and reef materials slightly more important than men did. And you'll recall when I was talking about my results a few slides ago, that these were the services that people viewed as destructive. So actually women were rating those destructive or bad services slightly higher than men. Another interesting thing was that men rated education and shoreline protection a little bit higher than women, and these are both, these are not provisioning services, they're sort of supporting and cultural services. So broadly, we kind of found that people place most importance on the provisioning services that most directly contribute to their needs, and this aligns with work that's occurred in the Pacific more broadly. And it kind of affirms that maybe ecosystem services really should be focusing on this contribution to universal human needs, and this aligns with some work that's coming out of the University of Exeter as well. Our findings also support the idea that it's probably important to elicit cultural ecosystem services in different ways, that perhaps comparing them in this rating method doesn't really do justice to how important they are. And finally, there's been calls recently saying that gender is a real blind spot in ecosystem services, and the sort of subtle gender differences we found did emphasise that gender differences are there, but they might be difficult to find. So of course, we were looking at the importance of ecosystem services to people. And there are likely more gender differences in, say, the division of labour around ecosystem services, or potentially access to ecosystem services. Which leads me rather nicely into the next chapter, which is trying to expand analysis of access to ecosystem services. So for this chapter, I zoomed in for a really in-depth case study of Aarhus Island, partially because of the sort of dependence and importance of marine ecosystem services there. And I asked, through formal interviews, I asked people about the barriers and enablers to benefiting from different provisioning services, and I asked them to describe the customary systems that existed and how these had changed over time. And so my interviews were purposefully sampled to get a range of diverse perspectives. So basically I wanted to talk to men, to women, to young people, to old people in all different clans. I also observed what was happening in the community and conducted informal interviews and then triangulated between them. And I analysed the results from both the field notes and the interviews in vivo around the different access mechanisms proposed by Ribot and Peluso, around the part of the value chain that people were referring to, and whether what they were talking about was a barrier or an enabler. So, for example, a quote like this: the women go to the reef nearby and come back. Where the waves break, that's their boundary. The open ocean and further out is for men to go fishing. Controlling is for men. I would have coded something along the lines of this. So, social access mechanisms around gender, different technologies, and physical access. And so I coded all my interviews and field notes this way, and that allowed me to populate a huge table of all the different provisioning services, the different potential access mechanisms, and who they apply to. But don't worry, I'm not going to show you that table because it's not so. Instead, I'm going to talk about access to fish. And here's a sort of rudimentary value chain from catch to preparing, which often involves smoking, transport, and marketing. Now, there are, of course, different ways of benefiting from ecosystem services along this value chain. So you might catch a fish and then eat it for dinner. but I'm not going to go into sort of the details of that today. Then I'm going to talk about a couple of the access mechanisms that turn out to be quite important. So firstly, there are different access mechanisms along the whole value chain, and what came up again and again in UNCLOS was market access, and this quote really exemplifies what people would often say about market access. So this woman said to me, I go and sell a fish, my husband gets the fish, I take the fish to market. When there's a lot of fish, it spoils my chances of selling all the fish. Too many fish makes the price drop. There's not a lot of markets for fish, so everyone goes to the one place. And so this is really starting to emphasize that it's not necessarily the availability, again, of ecosystem services or fish that might create barriers to people benefiting. I want to zoom in now specifically on the customary rules and institutions that might govern access and how these have changed over time. So here is a symbolic representation of UNCLOS. This is not how UNCLOS looks, but we have different clans here and different sort of reef areas and outer reef areas. And traditionally, there was a real divide between use of space. Use of space is very gendered, so women would glean and fish inside the reef and men would fish outside. There was also clans tended to fish on their side of the island and in the areas that belonged to them. When we zoom in on individual clans, there were quite complex rules around the rights to different timing. So for instance, one family or one individual, usually a clan leader, and usually a man, would have rights to, say, fishing at night. And if you wanted to go fishing at night, you'd have to go and ask his permission. Other families, or even the same family, might have rights to different methods of fishing and the rights to ban certain methods, for instance, diving at night with a torch. And others would be able to completely taboo or block off fishing in certain areas. So how has this changed over time, and what does it mean for different social groups? Well, firstly, the gendered division of space and the sort of clan-based spatial fishing hasn't changed very much. Those things still remain strong. But it's really these more intricate rules in the institutions around timing, methods, and areas that have faded over time, particularly for young men, and have faded less so for other species. So that's a bit complicated to get into. So, wellbeing in this chapter found that access mechanisms differ and overlap across value chains, that customary institutions are not static and changes will impact people differently. And so this has some implications. So co-management of fisheries is an increasingly popular way of governing fisheries. And I don't know if there's been much thought into what aspects of local institutions these co-management arrangements might actually be strengthening, and whether there's a way to try and design co-management to strengthen more effective or more fair parts of the institution. And of course, for conservation and development interventions, the implications of this are that ignoring access might actually make interventions less effective. So for example, in UNCLOS, increasing catch without changing market access isn't perhaps going to make much of a difference in terms of who's benefiting. And indeed, ignoring access may actually lead to interventions being unfair. Which leads me to ask, what is fair and why? I returned to Kaka and also continued to do this work in UNCLOS and asked people about a whole lot of different things around their reef. So about decision making, the rules, uses of the reef, had there been conflicts, and about fairness and stewardship. So I did this through 60 formal interviews, semi-structured interviews, and I forgot to mention this before, these were all in Papua New Guinea and Top Kitchen. And again, purposefully sampled to capture different perspectives. Combine this with observation, which turned out to be quite important, and informal interviews, which I again triangulate against. And so I analysed these interviews, and I'm still in the process analysing these interviews, partially similar to the previous chapter, using the different dimensions of justice, but also using data-driven coding, where you look at the themes that develop over reading through the interviews and develop your codes iteratively through that process. And so I'm going to talk through both a couple of findings from perceptions of fairness around distribution and a couple of findings around distribution, around procedural justice. When it came to distribution, in Kaka Island, people thought it was fair to restrict fishing, gleaning, and gear. And I was lucky enough to be there at a time where they just opened the reef that had been closed to fishing for probably a year to a year and a half. And all the people I talked to said that this was fair. There was not a problem with closing the reef. It was fair that everyone should not be able to fish. And this is even though closing the reef effectively blocked women from being able to go gleaning or fishing. But even women themselves said, no, this is fair, this is better for the community. Whereas in UNCLOS, I think you've probably already got a sense of this from the previous chapter, people thought it was unfair to restrict these things because of people's needs. So one man who held that role of sort of leader and so was in charge of certain areas of the reef said, many people go fishing and it isn't their right. I can't be too strict with the area that I own. If I'm strict, then someone else will go hungry. But alongside this kind of criteria of needs-based justice, other people thought that actually using certain gears and certain efforts, some people using certain gears and certain efforts, and this unequal costs was actually unfair. So this woman, for instance, emphasised that our husbands shouldn't go diving at night because the fish are sleeping and it's easy to get them. During the day, the fish are awake and alert, but if you go at night time, they are sleeping. Another 5 to 10 years and we won't have any big fish in the ocean. So what's captured really in this quote is a sense of unfairness around unequal costs to future generations and unequal benefits to people currently. And so there's really a tension in UNCLOS between this needs-based understanding of fairness and a sense of unfairness and inequality, and it's not really resolved. What about when it comes to decision-making? Interestingly, when I interviewed people about decision-making in both places, everyone said that when it comes to decision-making around the reef, we should have inclusive community decision-making. In interviews, this ranged from the leaders should come to us with proposals and the community should feed back to them and tell us what to do, or we as a community should get together and tell the leaders how things should work. But broadly, everyone thought that inclusive decision-making was a good idea. But in practice, in UNCLOS, it had been 5 years since the last whole community meeting. There really wasn't much evidence that this kind of ideal inclusive community decision-making was very common. Whereas in Kaka, there was a regular deliberative decision-making practice. What I mean by that is every Monday, the community would get together to discuss any issues in the community. And if this happened to involve rules and management of the coral reef, then that would come up as well. And this quote really emphasised to me the importance of this regular process for decision-making. Someone said, we argue over the land and the ocean. We must argue a dispute over it so it will be in good shape. The next generation will live off these things. If the elders don't dispute and talk about it, then I will destroy it and there'll be nothing in the future for kids. We must talk about these things. And so what this really captures, and what's coming out of my interviews, is that it's these very forums for arguing about costs and benefits, about what's fair and what's unfair, that really help to work towards justice in the Kaka community. So understandings of what's fair aren't necessarily fixed, might be forged and negotiated through public debate. Which suggests that perhaps there's actually a key role for a certain version of conflict in fair management of resources. It also suggests that, of course, justice dimensions are nested and criteria can change. So what I mean by that is actually in Kaka, what was considered fair in terms of costs and benefits was actually negotiated through the decision-making rather than being set. There's also can be a real gap between what is ideally fair and what happens in practice, and perhaps that's a key leverage point. The implications of this is that we should maybe start thinking about the forms and processes that provide the space and structure for meaningful arguments around negotiating trade-offs. So in sum, sort of shown that ecosystem services that directly support well-being are considered most important by people, and there are some social differences, but they can be subtle, and that other values that are not so easily measured, like cultural values, sometimes get lost in sort of valuations. Access to ecosystem services, particularly that access shaped by institution, can be fluid and affect people differently. And so some interesting future research search here could be how to leverage this fluidity in the face of environmental change to steer things to be more effective, more equitable. And finally, sometimes structured, very clearly defined conflict might help decide what's fair in terms of costs and benefits. And an interesting question from that is, can conservation and management actually design for fruitful conflict? I have some of the work from my literature review in review at the moment, and I'm revising the second data chapter and preparing the other two. And I've been lucky enough to be able to work with some of Christina Hicks' data and be involved in a great project around building adaptive capacity for climate change. And I would like to say thank you to a lot of people, particularly my amazing supervisory panel, who've been just a dream team to work with, really. Everyone who provided me research assistance, particularly JB, who sort of traipsed around very humid Kaka with me for a few months. The families who hosted me whilst I was in Papua New Guinea, and all people who helped me navigate the administrative bureaucracy of this place and have provided, sounding boards and listened to many